Guido Steinberg, welcome back to AICGS. It's good to see you back here with us at a time when it's really important to talk about common denominators between Germany and the United States. One of them is counterterrorism, your specialty, cybersecurity, things of that sort. With the initial period being somewhat, shall we say, turbulent between the Trump administration's taking over in Washington and relations with Europe, what I want to get right to is, given your knowledge of both sides of the fence, do you see, in an optimistic way, this area of concern about terrorism, counterterrorism measures, cyber warfare kind of things, do you see that as an opening to establish common ground with this new administration, and is Berlin ready to do that?
Well, for the time being, there is no reason to be optimistic. Mainly because of the harsh reactions from Berlin, including the Chancellor Angela Merkel, to the ban, the immigration ban from countries like Syria, Somalia, and so on. The reaction has been really harsh, and I think the gap between the worldviews of President Trump and Chancellor Merkel couldn't be wider. And since I expect that the old Chancellor will be the new Chancellor after the September elections, I think we will see major problems.
Can you talk about those problems, what they would be?
First, problems in worldview. We see lots of open criticisms of U.S. policy from the German side in the coming months. Possibly over the question of Russia sanctions, but I think that will be more of a Washington problem within the Republican Party.
Yes.
But over Russia policies, possibly Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so on. However, if you look at it from a practical point of view, there is common ground in counterterrorism. Both countries still have, or do have, a common interest in fighting ISIS. Mm-hmm. We do fight ISIS together, and especially Germany needs U.S. cooperation. We have seen that in 2016. There has been a number of attacks and attack plans, and the basic rule was that these attacks with ISIS background could be foiled whenever American security authorities gave us the initial information. Mm-hmm. That was mainly NSA information. It happened, for example, in the case of a young Syrian, Jabir al-Bakr, who was arrested in Chemnitz while planning an attack possibly at Berlin Tegel Airport. The initial information came from the NSA. But the worrying phenomenon is that the NSA did not catch all the relevant information. We had different plots in Ansbach, and in Würzburg by a Syrian in one case and a Pakistani or Afghani Pashtun in the other, where the perpetrators communicated with Syria electronically for quite a while, several weeks, perhaps even several months, and signals intelligence from the US did not catch this information. And I think that is worrying, simply because we have, as Germany has outsourced its intelligence collection to the United States. We badly need the U.S., and so that I think that we will see major efforts on the part of the German government, probably the Interior Ministry, probably parts of the Chancellor's office, like Department 6, which is responsible for intelligence coordination, to keep the working relationship going on the one hand, and secondly, what we have to do, we have to find out why the Americans are not able to catch all these guys anymore.
It's almost a reverse situation. I mean, it used to be that we would catch it and you wouldn't, and now you're saying that we've got some holes to fix too.
Well, it seems so, and I think one of the reasons is that the inflow of refugees has been so immense that even the NSA can't cope with the amount of information anymore. We have seen that to an extent with intelligence collection inside the United States.
Right.
In the case of the marathon bombings, for example.
Right.
We see that in Europe right now. That means for us, on the one hand, that we have to improve our improve our coordination with the Americans, but
Yeah.
we have to build independent capacities as well.
Let me ask you this, Guido. Do you think there's sufficient political support to do that in the Bundestag right now?
No,
Okay.
no, I don't think so.
What's going to change? I mean, if you have elections in September, what would lead you to think that that would change?
Well, I think it's necessity. I think it's necessity. On the one hand, it's very likely that we will see further plots in the coming months and years. Not necessarily successful ones, but we will see that the security situation in Germany has deteriorated. We have seen that already in 2016. The situation is really bad, first. The second aspect is that large parts of the German population demand solutions.
Right.
Yes.
And did that come about after Berlin?
No, and that is so worrying about
Yeah.
Germany.
It did not come about.
It did not come about. There were some measures taken
Yeah.
in order to improve surveillance of known sympathizers and supporters of IS and Al-Qaeda, but that's kind of basic. If you know that somebody is dangerous, you need to have the means to monitor him.
Right.
So there has been talk about that. But we do have problems with intelligence, signals intelligence, human intelligence. We do have problems with border control. We do not fight the terrorists on their soil as Germans, and I think that has to change. It will not change before the elections, and it will only change after the elections if we have more attacks, or if right-wing populists become so strong that they will exert pressure in this regard.
That's a pretty high price to pay.
Yes, but I think we will pay the price anyhow.
Talk a little bit about more the European parameters of this. How much of that has changed? In other words, when you get what's going on, what happens in Nice, and then you have in Brussels, and then you have now in Berlin, does that become an impetus for the European parameters to become strengthened, or is it still too disaggregated?
Counterterrorism is still very much in the center of our thinking of sovereignty, governmental sovereignty. So
Right.
I don't think that we will see major improvements in cooperation. European security authorities do cooperate on a regular basis for a while already. But on the one hand, there is a structural problem. Because we do have a central authority in global counterterrorism, and that's based not far from here in the United States.
Right.
So we are communicating, all security authorities are communicating directly with the CIA, with the NSA, and not so much with the French and with the Brits. I hope that will improve, but I don't think that is the core of the problem. The core of the problem is that we do have countries with decent security structures, like France, although they have a big problem, like Britain. And we have other countries which have problems. The Germans, because of their history and political culture, and smaller countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Austria, who in relation to the general population have far higher numbers of potential jihadist terrorists than we do. So it's not all, cooperation is a good thing, but if your security authorities are weak in the first place, we need security reform in all these countries.
If you were to imagine that between now and September there would be one, possibly two, of some significance, some incidents, if you want to call them that, are you concerned, and you just hinted at that the right-wing activity, and perhaps not just in Germany, would pick up in intensity? And what would that do to the potential of a coalition in September after the election in dealing with any of this stuff? Would it freeze it? Would it make it so polarized that nothing would get done? How do you see that happening? Because a lot of people are concerned about that right now.
Well, I'm convinced that if ISIS has the personnel in place, they will try to perpetrate attacks before the elections. They have made that clear. They want civil strife. And I wouldn't only concentrate on jihadist terrorism, but also incidents by right-wing extremist terrorists, like the thing that now happened in Quebec.
In Canada.
In Canada. And we do have a very active right-wing extremist scene. It's part of our tradition, perhaps, but we have about 10,000 right-wing extremists. Many of them are ready to use violence. And I think if we see major terrorist attacks that will give new impetus to the AFD campaign, which has lost impetus in recent weeks and months, and that will have repercussions in the general elections. However, until now, my impression is that right-wing populists still have more problems in Germany than in other European countries, especially France, and I do not expect a very strong showing at the general elections, not more than 15%. That is bad enough, but it's a fact of life in Europe right now, and it won't keep the other parties from building a decent
You mentioned
coalition.
before, you seem to be suggesting that it's possible that Merkel might get another coalition government together.
Oh, she will.
She will.
She will.
You think if this happened, though, it makes it fragile. If the public at large is anxious, and test me out on this if you think I'm right about this, because I tend to think that in the case of the way that the thing was handled, I think in Munich last year, with this lone wolf, the way that was handled led me to think that if the Germans feel on the whole that when something like that happens, whether it's in Berlin or whether it's in Munich, as long as they have the impression that the authorities have a handle on this, they feel okay.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, they do, but they don't anymore.
They don't anymore.
And that's because all the mistakes that have been committed in the history of the Anis al-Amiri case. So many mistakes by so many different security authorities. And many people have been shocked because it is well known that we do have relatively weak intelligence services. That's part of our political culture. It's because of the role of the Gestapo and the Stasi in East Germany. Fair enough. But I always had the impression that we have functioning police services.
Right.
But nothing worked in this case. And now we have governments, not only the federal government, but also the governments of North Rhine-Westphalia and Berlin, taking no action. And we have an interior minister who doesn't take decisive action either. So many people in the country are quite dissatisfied with, well, I would call it complacency by our politicians. And this will have repercussions in the coming months. People want security solutions.
Right.
They want the personnel.
Right.
And most people in the country are not convinced that the candidates for interior minister proposed by the CDU and the SPD are the right ones.
And you just mentioned North Rhine-Westphalia. Of course, that's where the big election is in the spring, and could be a bellwether for what's going to happen in September.
Yes, I'm convinced that the SPD will have huge problems remaining in power in North Rhine-Westphalia, especially because the AFD will have a very strong showing, and partly because domestic security will be an issue, and the government, the Düsseldorf government, has utterly failed in recent months. It hasn't even assumed responsibility for what has happened, and the events have been scandalous.
Let me go back to the final part of this discussion, Guido, going back to the shock, I think, and awe that this government seems to be radiating in Europe for many Europeans and Germans in particular. Apart from the style question, I think, which is something that people can argue about, this is, Trump is certainly not Barack Obama, and there's going to be an adjustment necessary to his style of carrying out the presidency. What gives you, if I can ask it this way, some sense of optimism about the way that Berlin and Washington can talk to each other on issues of concern that we share? And will there be an opportunity to demonstrate that in the next 6 months? And by the way, regardless of who wins the election, but let's assume it's Merkel again, do you see a continuity there that can transcend the immediate, I would almost say, hostility to Trump in Europe in general and Germany as well, that allows people to say, look, we have to work with this government. This government is not, we can complain about it, we can say we don't like it, but there's the expression, we can talk about them, but we can also work with them. So what is the agenda that you would set out if you were advising Merkel and Trump to say, here's your agenda for working out some common problems that we must face? They're unavoidable. What would they be?
Well, I think counterterrorism is not the worst issue, because common interests are quite clear, and my impression is that the U.S., especially with this ban of immigrants from Syria and other countries, what the U.S. has done too much, Germany has not done enough.
That's an interesting way to put it.
Monitoring, vetting people who have entered the country, and that's why we have a problem. I don't think that the U.S. had a problem with terrorist immigrants from these countries. There is no evidence. But anyhow, I think that could be a topic, especially when the security situation develops in Europe, develops in the way it did in 2016. Then we Europeans will need more cooperation with the U.S., regardless of matters of style. I think the decisive foreign policy question, though, for the Europeans will be whether the Trump administration decides to improve relations with Russia by giving up on the sanctions. That will, of course, first pose problems here in Washington, but if the Trump administration remains committed to the sanctions, let's say to a realist Russia policy, to deterrence in Eastern Europe, I think there will be common ground, and that will probably help the Merkel government, the current one and probably the next one, to argue that it is not only necessary but also worthwhile to cooperate with the Trump government.
Within that comment, you are also saying, but if it doesn't happen, we've got trouble ahead.
Yes, I think so, because it will that will leave European governments, especially the conservative ones, who have defended the Russia sanctions against strong opposition from the inside, especially the Social Democrats. So the opposition within the government in Germany, it will bring them into an extremely difficult position, and it's very hard to foresee how they will react. I have doubts that they will be able to keep up the sanctions. And if they don't keep up the sanctions, I think that will embolden Putin and his KGB mafia in Moscow. We'll see lots of efforts on the part of Russia to destabilize European governments before and after the elections.
Yeah, welcome to that game. We've just been through that to some extent. Well, let's hope, I think, at the end of the day that as I usually try to say and keep in mind, that the sum of the relations between Germany and the United States are greater than its parts, but we can't take that for granted. And under the circumstances, it's good that you're able to talk about it. Thank you very much for coming.
I thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you back.